Great, thank you to the panel, and let's dive right in. So this is the first of a policy doubleheader. Christmas has come early because we're going to have two sessions focused on policy today. This one is going to look specifically at the latest policy developments from the perspective of policymakers, and we're going to look at that through the lens of this idea of market convergence, which I'll describe in a few seconds. But briefly, I'm Ben Rattenbury, I'm Vice President for Policy at Solvera, and it's truly an honor to be here today with this panel of world-leading policymaking experts in carbon markets, and that's no exaggeration. Rather than introduce them all myself, I'd like to invite them to introduce themselves. So maybe Layla, we can just go down the line.
Hi.
Should be.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Layla Barber. I'm the Deputy Director in the Office of Capital Markets at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. Thanks for having me.
So I'm Benedict. I'm the Director General for Climate Change at the National Climate Change Secretariat. We are part of the Prime Minister's office in Singapore.
Hi, I'm Martin Heschen. I'm the Vice Chair of the Paris Crediting Mechanism, which was established under the Paris Agreement doing standards for crediting. And I have a day job in the European Commission working on international carbon markets.
As expected, my three panelists were far too modest about their achievements and importance in the market. So just to maybe kind of paint a broader picture, so Ben and Martin are both very active in the Article 6 negotiations through the UNFCCC, but then Ben is also very active domestically within Singapore, and we're going to hopefully hear a little bit more about what's happening there in terms of the carbon tax, which is quite innovative. And then Layla, of course, has a key role here in the US federal government working on the guidance recently on carbon markets, which again we'll hope to hear more about. So really excited to have you here. So just to set up the conversation then, we've been thinking for a couple of years now about this idea that there is an inevitable shift towards the convergence of various types of carbon markets, voluntary, international, domestic compliance markets, and so on. And whilst it's going to be a slow process and it's going to be bumpy, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, I think that there is a high likelihood that these markets are moving towards a kind of convergence, or at least interoperability and increasing alignment. But I really wanted to test this idea with the panel, and then in so doing get the latest updates on the areas that they're working on. So let's dive right in then. I'd just invite the panel to kind of try and pull out the so what for the market actors who are trying to build and navigate this fascinating young market. And maybe I'll start with you, Layla, and ask you, what are your thoughts on this idea of market convergence? Do you buy the thesis, or do you think it's all bunkum? And if you do agree with it, then where do you think we are right now in that journey?
So I think I mean, yes, I see that this is probably where we're going, although we're not, the U.S. government, at least Treasury, is not kind of thinking that far right now. We're very much focused on sort of where the market has been and where we're going, kind of where we are currently. And we at Treasury especially, we really think about VCMs the way we would look at other securities markets. So is it working as well as it should be? And right now we see that we're very early in the market evolution here. And so other markets that we look at also have kind of bumpy starts. And so we see that this is sort of expected for us, but we believe in this market. And so we think that this is actually, like, we're at a really interesting early stage where guidance is being put out, principles are being set forth. There's a lot of good happening. I think for us, we're thinking about right now is a real opportunity for market participants to provide feedback around all of this, like the guidance that Treasury's put out and other federal agencies, and the work that's being done by some of the standard setters and other market participants. This is the chance for kind of people and other kind of players in this market to let us know what's working and what's not. So very early, but we're hopeful.
Thanks, and I like this message that because it's so early, there's an opportunity to shape it. So let's build this market in the best possible image. Ben, what are your thoughts?
I think what we have noticed, at least maybe over the last 5 years, is that markets have really bloomed, and they have become a lot more decentralized. So if you look at crediting standards programs that are issuing carbon credits, I was told right now the latest figure is about 70 to 80 different programs doing. So if you look back about 5 years ago, depending on how you define it, 10, 20 different standards. So it's been a huge increase. Part of it driven by the conclusion of Article 6 in Glasgow. I think that was the year in which the demand actually peaked, but also greater interest in corporates and countries in terms of how you can leverage markets to help meet their objectives itself. So I think that to us that's a plus, because that means that there are more actors out there, more stakeholders out there looking at unlocking opportunities, abatement opportunities that would not have occurred otherwise. So to your question on greater convergence, for us, we look at it in two parts. The first part is that in terms of pathways, methodologies, approaches, actually we feel that a divergent model, a more diversified model works better, because it's about seeking and unlocking new opportunities. And you don't want to standardize that too much. You want to give stakeholders the opportunities to pathfind. But having said that, the outcomes, I do think that there needs to be some form of standardization, because you need people to understand what exactly do you mean by additionality, what do you mean by permanence. I think there needs to be some, you need to coalesce around a common set of standards. If not, buyers out there will be very confused. You can't have 70, 80 different programs having 70, 80 different definitions of additionality. It just wouldn't work. And I think what the work being done by some of the key method standards like ICVCM, ICAO, CORSIA, I think are particularly useful in terms of helping land towards a greater standardization and convergence of what good quality is. And the role of rating agencies like Silvera, where you not only look at the methodologies, but you go one layer below that and rate individual projects under the same methodology, gives you an additional level of granularity. And I think that's important. So I feel that it's the quality standards in which we must be a lot more active in terms of driving towards greater convergence, while giving players the space to seek divergent approaches towards generating credits. Yeah.
Thank you, Ben. That's fascinating, actually, this idea that the means, the number of crediting methodologies, for example, are actually proliferating and diverging, if anything. You mentioned from around 20 to around 70 different crediting standards. But then the ends, the impact, that needs to be standardized. We need to have a common set of definitions there. So really interesting. Thank you. Martin, what do you think?
All right, well, I think I come from a slightly different perspective in the sense that I'm here to represent a body that is the global body on crediting. And it's responsible to a whole range of stakeholders, including market stakeholders, but particularly also to countries that are getting involved, both buyers and sellers. And we've got a very particular mandate as well. And what I would say is that our mandate is particularly focused on how crediting is going to deliver on net zero, with a range of decisions made in Glasgow that are oriented towards delivering that. So we want to avoid lock-in of high emissions that are unsustainable. We need to ensure that crediting levels are consistent with country policies. Paris alignment essentially being the kind of narrative around which we're trying to do things, and there's some complexity under that. And then I think the other thing that strikes me is that we have a lot of discussion on effectiveness, like is this a real ton? Is it contributing to that net zero pathway? And sometimes we don't have a discussion around fairness, because I think we need to have markets that are effective, deliver what they should do, but for them to be sustainable long term, they need to deliver for all of the different stakeholders. And sometimes the poor old host country is left out of the consideration, and that's something that's very much in our minds. Why so? Because all countries have agreed to contribute towards moving towards net zero, and there's an obligation under the Paris Agreement to do progression in terms of the NDCs. Our current NDCs, the targets that countries have, are twice the level that they need to be in 2030, and so we need to have deep emission cuts and commitments to deep emission cuts to make good on Paris. And in that context, the big question is how are these crediting markets, or any market, going to deliver to close that gap? Because we hear that that's an essential thing that this market is meant to do. And that does require thinking very carefully about things that sound technical, additionality, baselines, what lock-in is, what the crediting levels are. So I think the body that I'm working on is really struggling with some of those things and could benefit from the ingenuity and cleverness of stakeholders here and elsewhere in addressing those problems. At the moment, we have 2, perhaps 3 big decisions on our agenda for decision in October, in 2 weeks. One on how methodology should work in the context of Paris, how they can be Paris-aligned. Another on how we address removals, because the UN system hasn't comprehensively addressed removals and issues of reversals in the past. And there's a lot of experience in the voluntary market on that, but it's also a very vexed issue in terms of how you ensure permanence, risk assessment, etc. So those 2 big standards, which were not accepted last year by parties, are being presented again by the body that I represent in November, hopefully for endorsement. And then there's a third element to this, which is the social, environmental, and human rights safeguards, which in a UN context are difficult and complex, slightly different perhaps than the discussion we might have in a room here. And it's important that we have those protections and safeguards in our system, and we're working on that as well. I don't think we're going to get everything right, because it is a big constituency that needs to be served within the UN, and the body that I'm in has representatives from all over the world. But I think one of the benefits that I hope that we will deliver is that it is one that has broad consensus, and on top of that it's accountable or responsible to the parties, including sellers, and that's an important part of the acceptability of offsetting, at least in the world that I live in. So that's
Fantastic.
my piece.
Well, thank you, Martin, for kind of zooming out and giving us that big picture. Of course, markets don't exist in a vacuum. It's all in the context of decarbonisation, both at the global level, at national levels through NDCs, and at corporate levels as well. And I'm glad that you mentioned Paris alignment, because that's something that I'm keen to pick up on, so we'll come back to that. But Leila, I want to turn to you now. You touched on the announcement back in May from the Biden-Harris administration regarding the principles for high-integrity voluntary carbon markets. And I have to say, that was one of the strongest signals that I've seen so far within the market in terms of the level of political backing that the market got, on the condition that it could be high integrity, and very, very important condition there. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about the next steps following that May announcement, including some remarks yesterday from your senior officials in the Treasury.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe if everyone's not aware, in May this past year, a group of federal agencies, including Treasury, set forth a set of voluntary carbon markets, a policy statement, and then a set of principles. And we were hoping that the principles would highlight sort of areas of the market that we thought needed attention. So broadly, it was broken down around issues around supply integrity and demand integrity and market integrity. So we had, really good response to those. And we think even since May, we've seen a lot of improvements in the supply integrity and demand integrity side, like lots of efforts being made. So right now, my office at Treasury, so we're capital markets, we're very much digging into the market integrity side of it. So what are things we can do about market structure itself to kind of help the buying and selling of credits? I should say that this comes from a lot of outreach that we've done with US corporate buyers of credits, and so we really wanted to talk to kind of the demand side and understand what are the pain points that they're feeling. And as Treasury, we're not a regulator, but we can push policy to help kind of ease those pain points. So two things that I think we're digging in on right now, and I think were reflected well in yesterday's comments by our Deputy Secretary and our Undersecretary. And I have heard, this morning with Al's, or this afternoon with Al's presentation as well, is around sort of data protocols. And then the second is around price transparency. So on the data protocol side, we're interested in kind of the work that's being done to provide, tagging where appropriate of carbon credits to better understand like location and ratings and regardless of the registry that it came from, because buyers are telling us like this data is really hard to find and it's all bespoke, and to be able to kind of build a kind of more efficient scaled up market, we need to be able to like have this data for benchmarking purposes or for just creating comps. And so that's one thing that we're interested in, and we know that work is being done in this space, and we're very supportive of that. The second is around price transparency. So we know that price transparency in a largely over-the-counter market is very challenging. So, we are thinking through, not bias, but supportive of efforts to, create like a centralized repository for price and transaction data, historical data. And just, being able to kind of have that information, I think buyers are telling us like that's what they need to be able to kind of scale up and really participate. I can't remember who said it, but the fact that buyers are paying so much more than the credit is worth, like those are the efficiencies that we think we need to get sorted out to really make this market one that is scalable and where the frictions are less than they are today.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Leda. And it's interesting you mentioned this point about price transparency, because it kind of touches on the point that, Martin, you made about fairness and the push for more information about benefit sharing and exactly where the revenues are going as well, which I know that some people are pushing for quite hard. So, Ben, maybe I'll turn to you and then the rest of the panel on the next question, which is looking around the world at various global and national and subnational markets, where do you see the most interesting developments taking place right now? And you're not allowed to talk about Singapore because that's obviously one of the most exciting places right now for carbon, but that would be too easy.
Well, thanks so much, Ben. So I think there are two areas. I'll focus more on the first area because that hasn't been talked about much, is this area about transition. So we are trying to develop this space on transition credits. And essentially what transition credits is about crediting from scaling down fossil fuel activity. So in this case, early retirement of coal-fired power stations and then replacing the coal through an accelerated deployment of renewables itself. So this is a space that we are looking at. And the reason why we are looking at is that if you look around the world right now, 1 out of every 7 tons of CO2 emitted comes from a coal-fired power station, particularly in Asia itself. And if we don't do it, and many of these coal-fired power stations in Asia are very young. They are like 12, 14 years old, which means that they still have a good 20 years, if not 25, 30 years of lifespan to actually go. And if we don't accelerate the retirement of these coal-fired power stations, it means that over the next few decades, you would wipe out 2/3 of the carbon budget that is required for us to stay on track to meet the Paris temperature goals. So it's a critical challenge for us within Asia, and it's also difficult because most, if not most of these coal-fired power stations are protected by long-term power purchase agreement contracts. So we need to break that and for it to make economic sense and or rather a viable pathway to actually decommission these plants itself. So we are trying. We think carbon markets is going to play an important role. There are other efforts that have tried to accelerate the reduction in coal-fired power stations. Many of these don't look at, some of the early efforts, including some of the major ones, don't use carbon markets as a lever, and it has proven to be quite challenging, the scale at which you try to push some of these without carbon markets. So we are bringing carbon revenue into the financing stack itself to hopefully try to make it viable. And I think the key question of doing this is to ensure that even as we do this, we shouldn't be incentivizing power plants that already should be going out of power. Or you don't want to incentivize a plant in a network which is where there's significant leakage. So you take one coal plant out and then demand just flows somewhere else. So on this angle, we do agree that actually you need to put in place some sort of a jurisdictional approach. The challenge about a jurisdictional approach is what is the pathway towards it? how can we stage the implementation of a jurisdictional approach for this to actually make sense itself. And the last final piece, which is going to be quite challenging, is just transition. Because at least in Asia, the core ecosystem employs about, estimates about slightly more than 5 million workers. And if you don't look at a just transition for some of these workers and they become unemployed, they become displaced, it's politically unwearable. So even if we get the economics right, politically, it just won't fly. So you need to think about a model in which there's retraining of some of these workers. And some of the good examples you've seen in places like South Africa, I think are worth looking at further to see how they can replicate. So this is one of the big challenges which I think offers space for carbon markets to come into play and to be able to leverage markets to address a very important and pressing issue. The other area which I just wanted to highlight very, very briefly, I think which Martin talked about earlier, is removals. And we have been working in the Article 6.4 space to try to put out removals guidance for both nature, which actually would have to cover both nature and tech, and actually the opportunities that are actually quite significant. It's a very nascent space, but if you look at the potential to unlock new abatement that would not have occurred otherwise, there are lots of opportunities. And I think there's still a lot of work in terms of developing those guidance. And hopefully, like Martin, I share the hope that at least we can hopefully get some of this guidance agreed at the upcoming COP. And I think that lays the basis for further work going forward.
Thank you very much, Ben. Martin, how about you? Where do you see the most interesting developments taking place?
This is a difficult one, right? Because my main role here is to talk about the crediting standard and delivering a benchmark. But I do come from where I come from, right? And so for the European Union, at least, we've got a long tradition of carbon pricing, which is well embedded and got very high carbon prices. And certainly my colleagues back at home feel that that was delivered through a hard slog, and we've learned a lot of lessons along the way. And as part of the Commission proposal, has not yet been accepted by the Member States to go for a 90% reduction by 2040. There's a big emphasis on carbon markets delivering a large proportion of that. And that drives the carbon price, which I think is something that you hear in the negotiations from the EU a lot, like the NDCs, the demand. Because we all know the potential of the market, but if you don't actually have the price signal, that potential won't be realized, and the cost savings that are put out there are not real. So I do think that if I was thinking about my colleagues at home, which I probably shouldn't be, that they emphasize domestic pricing as being an opportunity. Why? Because it does drive down emissions, and it's an effective and efficient way of doing so. But also there's revenue recycling opportunities, and certainly within the EU, the revenues that are earned from sales of allowances are dedicated to modernization, to just transition, so dealing with these sites where former coal mines were there to retrain people, provide social protections, but also to invest in the rather expensive mitigation options that aren't quite at market yet, so that there's a virtuous circle, and that's certainly been sold. And that's not to say that crediting is not part of the EU's thoughts at the moment, because the EU has extended its targets to what it calls LULUCF, the forestry and land sector, and engaging that sector in markets is probably via a project route, so there's an experimentation there. So just, I think, look at what we're doing. We're not saying we're perfect by any means, but I do think there's been an experiment going on for over 20 years within the EU about how to make carbon pricing work. And I'm not going to tell you about the mistakes, because there were many. I'll just tell you that we learned from those mistakes and are doing better.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. We're racing through the clock here, which is unfortunate because fascinating discussion. But very briefly, Ben, I'd like to invite you to say a little bit about what you see coming with the next round of NDCs, which are due by the middle of February, I understand. So I won't ask you to speak to Singapore's NDC, but in general, what's the kind of mood music that you're picking up in terms of the general level of ambition we can expect from the next round of NDCs, which of course will be for 2035. Back to Martin's point about the whole system needs more demand. We need more ambition in there in order to drive the decarbonisation through carbon markets and other mechanisms. So yeah, your thoughts on NDCs, Ben?
So we are committed towards submitting our NDC by, I think the exact date is, which I've heard many times, 10th February. We asked around some of our key partners, and many of them are actually also working towards that timeline itself. We know that some may actually slip and may not meet the exact timeline, but they are also still working towards releasing it next year. But I think the important point about the next NDC, especially in the context of markets, is that if you look back to Glasgow, there was a flurry of net zero pledges. But net zero by 2050 or 2060, it's 20, 30 years down the road. For us, if you want to be on a credible pathway towards it, you need a very clear transition plan. You need to have very clear interim milestones. And I think that's where the next NDC, the 2035 NDCs, actually give you that clarity. The other significance of the next round of NDCs is that we are now moving into this common time frame period, where every 5 years you actually need to lay out your NDC for the next 10 years itself. And that's important, because that actually plots the pathway towards wherever you say you're going by 2050 or 2060. The other important point about the next NDC, at least from the market's perspective, when we're trying to develop markets, is what exactly does it mean, at least for Article 6, in terms of how long is a country prepared to do corresponding adjustments? Is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? And given that crediting periods actually are much shorter than the overall lifespan of the project, actually having this clarity is very important in terms of injecting confidence into the market. So we do see the next round of NDC next year as actually being quite pivotal in terms of driving overall ambition, but also in terms of moving into a new phase whereby you have got more information out to actually help markets work much better. Thanks.
Thanks, Ben. No, that's helpful historical context, because of course 2035 is halfway between 2020 and 2050, so it's actually already halfway between the net zero target date and when Paris came into force. Martin, as Vice Chair of the subsidiary body for the Article 6 mechanism, or SPASM, some have decided to name it, how do you see the subsidiary body's work contributing to the evolution of standards? And in particular, interested in your thoughts on the definition of integrity and Paris alignment, which you mentioned before.
Yeah, I have to say it's the Paris crediting mechanism, and SPASM is a wonderful name, very catchy, so bad it's good, but it's the Paris crediting mechanism that we've decided to call ourselves. But yeah, I mean, going back maybe to the first round of discussions we've had, it's really great that these high integrity principles have been put out there to kind of drive the move to up integrity standards. Of course, there are different definitions and different bits of emphasis about what's important in terms of high integrity. There's the ton integrity, there's human rights, there's a range of things. And I was just at a ratings agency thing earlier on, and it became clear that there are trade-offs, right, for buyers between these different things. But from my personal and governmental perspective, we're chasing the ton, and the other things are co-benefits. And I do think that high integrity is sometimes interpreted as fixing some of the problems of the past, like additionality, issues to do with monitoring even and verification and the reliability of that. But the Paris challenge is that we can no longer credit just improvements on BAU. Like an improvement on business as usual will just inflate the bubble and defer action. So the challenge is to have these pathways to net zero elaborated in a way that they can be used as a basis for crediting. And that's very much a discussion we're having within the body at the moment, because it's complicated, and you know, I think under the CDM, which I worked on, everybody knew what would happen anyway, which is a counterfactual question, and you could never prove somebody wrong. But that whole basis for additionality is complicated. You need to show that what's happening because of your intervention wouldn't have happened anyway, and then you can say that maybe there's a credit. That's not good enough anymore. One needs to ask whether this project is actively contributing to closing a gap in the context of a country's policy. So Paris alignment is a tougher task than fixing the problems of the past. It's actually about addressing what this thing is meant to be doing for the future. And I think there's it's like almost a slow realization that there's more to be done in the crediting market, and I don't know that appreciation is general. And then to go back a little bit to this issue of, we were talked about the energy transitions, etc., and the need for a sectoral or a governmental approach. I think in all of this, there's this question that the voluntary markets and corporate action is enormously welcome and enormously important. But a question I would put out there is what level of action is it going to drive the voluntary impulse to deliver, and what price will it sustain? And because I am a governmental official, it's certainly our idea within the EU that without a government intervention to point to what needs to happen, you will not generate prices that are at the level that will get the interventions to get us there. So back to the NDCs, etc. The NDCs are not Paris aligned. The mechanism needs to be, if we're to have an active and a market that contributes to closing the gap, you need action on both sides, the demand and the supply side. Demand that's commensurate with the pathway we need to go on, and a crediting system that will accelerate the action rather than perhaps defer it. Very general comments, but...
No, that's really helpful. Thank you, Martin. So I'm going to open it up to the floor for questions very shortly, but Leila, I do want to get your thoughts on the previous question that I asked the other two, which was around where do you think there's interesting developments elsewhere? I know that your focus is very much domestically within the US, but I would expect that when you were developing your guidance for this statement in May, you probably had a look at what was happening elsewhere. And I'm wondering if there's anywhere around the world or any particular type of mechanism that kind of caught your eye that you thought was interesting and that inspired you when you were designing your guidance. And apologies for the unscripted question.
Yeah, no, so I was going to say, I can't step on our Department of State colleagues who are very focused on what's going on abroad, so I'm going to stick to the US. I think I'm very excited by work being done by the Department of Energy. My colleague is speaking in the next panel, but having the government directly purchase carbon removal credits, I think, is like a really interesting direction to go in. And then I also just wanted to give a shout out to the CFTC. They've released their final guidance for regulated exchanges that list carbon credit futures. And so I think that, adding certainty where we can will only help the market. So I sidelined your question.
Great job. Like a true pro. Thank you, Leila. Right, so now I'm happy to announce we have a very special surprise. We have a special guest. I can't see him, but I'm sure he's in the room. COP29 in Baku is just 46 days away. And it's a real pleasure to have with us today the Article 6 lead for the COP29 presidency, Magzad Husseinov. So Magzad, I'd like to invite you up to the stage just briefly to say a few words about your plans, how it's going, and what's next.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Silvera, for organizing such an event that sheds the light to the different perspectives of the carbon markets. I'm pleased to see familiar faces around. And I'm going to brief you on the current stage of the negotiations and the presidency visions. The COP29 presidency, we commenced earlier this year to engage with the parties in the technical and political level. And then we had some sort of fruitful discussions with non-party stakeholders in order to get their perspectives as well. Throughout the year, we've got quite productive engagements. In one session, we made extra mile on some issues. We delivered and handed over some issues to the Secretariat, and then we commend the work of Secretariat on that, to completion of some works, and they are working on other works as well. In terms of the next steps, we are going to host the next week the intersessional on 6.2 and the 6.4, and then Paris Credit Mechanism next meeting in Baku. We commend and acknowledge the work of the Paris Credit Mechanism, the enormous amount of work they have done so far. So we expect they completed their work in Baku and then submit the documents on methodology and removals for endorsement to Baku. We are keen to finalize the Article 6 this year because we consider Article 6 as a key tenet of the Paris Agreement, and unfortunately we failed to operationalize it almost a decade, and we consider it's a great disservice to the Paris Agreement, and we're keen to finalize it this year because we consider Article 6 important in terms of the enhancing capital markets, enabling, bolstering ambitions in mitigation and adaptation, and then enabling the parties, those who need carbon credits to use to implement their climate plans and for their NDCs or other mitigation, international mitigation purposes or other purposes. And the fact that almost 80% of NDCs now, current NDCs, refer to carbon markets as their national plan, and it's important. So we expect, and call, in every occasion we call for parties to engage constructively in order to solve all contentious issues. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Magda, for coming along and giving that update. I mean, clearly a very skilled and disciplined diplomat, but I think what we heard there was some optimism. It's not going to be easy, but it seems that there's a real push on Article 6 from the COP29 presidency. One of the top priorities, as I understand it, alongside the new collective quantified goal on finance. So watch this space.